Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Andy Cahan, Director of Author Events, and I am very excited to introduce our guest this evening. When Eric Larson, John Grisham, Candace Millard, John Krakauer, and Louise Erdrich line up to praise a book, as a reader, you are guaranteed to be holding the work of a great storyteller in your hands. The fact that the author is a longtime contributor to The New Yorker, the winner of a George Polk Award, and the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, The Lost City of Z, just seals the deal. His latest book, Killers of the Flower Moon, The Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI, tells the chilling true life story of one of the most sinister conspiracies in US history. A reviewer in Newsday writes, the author's reporting and archival sleuthing ballast a powerful account which evokes the noirish worlds of the movies. His closing pages are gripping and downright frightening. Please welcome David Grann.
Thank you all so much for coming tonight. It's great to be here in Philadelphia to talk about my new book, The Killer. I should know the name of my book by now. The Killers of the Flower Moon, The Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI. This project began, it was now about 5 years ago, when I made a trip out to the Osage Nation in northeast Oklahoma. And when I was there, I visited the Osage Nation Museum and came across this panoramic photograph on the wall. This is only a fraction of it, and if you have the book, you could see it across the title page. It went across the whole wall of the museum. It was quite enormous. The photograph was taken in 1924, and it showed members of the Osage Nation along with white settlers, and it seemed like a very innocent pageant. But I noticed when I was there that a panel was missing, that it had been cut out. It was actually this panel on this side. And I asked the museum director what had happened to that panel. And she said it contained a figure so frightening that she had decided to remove it. And she then pointed to the missing panel and she said the devil was standing right there. And the project really grew out of trying to understand who that figure was and the anguishing history he embodied. And it led me to one of the most mysterious and sinister crime stories in American history, one that I believe tells a much larger story about the country. Now, to understand the murders, they took place during the early beginnings of the 20th century. You need to understand that back then, the Osage were millionaires because of oil deposits under their land in Oklahoma. To obtain the oil that was there, prospectors had to pay the Osages for leases and royalty. And there was only about 2,000 or so Osage on the registered tribal roll. And they would receive a quarterly check each year. And beginning when the oil was discovered and began to be drilled in the early 20th century, they might receive a check for $100 each quarter. But then it grew to 1,000, and then it grew into the millions. In 1923, the year alone, those 2,000 or so Osage received collectively what would be worth today more than $400 million. They had become, they were considered at that point the wealthiest people per capita in the world. A New York newspaper said, lo and behold, the Indian, instead of starving to death, enjoys a steady income that turns bankers green with envy. Now, the public had become transfixed by the Osage wealth, which belied long-standing stereotypes of Native Americans that traced all the way back to the first brutal contact with whites, the original sin from which the country was born. Reporters with prejudice and envy would go out to Osage Territory and tantalize the readers with stories of the quote-unquote red millionaires and the plutocratic Osage with their terracotta mansions, their chauffeured cars, their servants, many of whom were white, and their fur coats. It was said at the time, whereas one American might own a car, each Osage owned 11 of them. I always like this picture in particular because it shows you the rapid transformation where you have a traditional Osage mother with her daughters dressed as flappers. Now this is actually pretty remarkable. I was able to find, and the Osage had a lot of money, and so they had cameras, so it took a lot of photographs. One of them had an early moving camera and actually shot silent footage. This is footage shot from the 20s. And so you can get a sense of these boom towns. That's Pawhuska, one of the biggest boom towns, the center of the Osage County seat. But you just get a sense. That's a triangle building, which is one of the first skyscrapers in the area. But you just get a sense of what life was like back then. Now, to understand the tangled history of how the Osage had gotten a hold of this wealth, you need to go back all the way to the 17th century, when the Osage had laid claim to much of the central part of this country, a territory that stretched from what is now Missouri and Kansas all the way to the Rockies. President Thomas Jefferson called the Osage the Great Nation, and in 1804 he actually met with a delegation of Osage chiefs. And he assured them that he would treat them only as friends from here on out, and so would this country and the federal government. But he quickly began to force them off their land, and within a few decades, the Osage were forced to cede more than 100 million acres of their ancestral land. In the 1860s, after being confined to a reservation in southeastern Kansas, they were again under siege by white settlers. And among them was the family of Laura Ingalls Wilder, who later wrote Little House on the Prairie, as I'm sure you all know, based loosely on her experiences. And as seen in the novel, Laura asks her mom, quote, "Why don't you like Indians?" "I just don't like them, and don't lick your fingers, Laura." Quote, "This is Indian country, isn't it?" Laura said. "What did we come to this country for if you don't like them?" One evening, Laura's father explains to her that the government will soon make the Osage move away. Quote, "That's why we are here, Laura. White people are going to settle all this country, and we get the best land because we get here first and take our pick." In fact, many squatters began to take the land by force and massacred several of the Osage. A U.S. government official at the time said, quote, "The question will suggest itself, which of these people are the savages?" In the 1870s, the Osage agreed to sell their Kansas lands and search for a new homeland. They considered purchasing 1.5 million acres in what was then Indian Territory and what is now Oklahoma. Although this land was vast, most whites regarded it as, quote, "broken, rocky, sterile, and utterly unfit for cultivation," as one U.S. government official put it. Which is why this Osage chief stood up at the time at a council meeting and said, "My people will be happy in this land. We should move there because the white man will finally leave us alone." And so the Osage bought this seemingly forsaken territory for 70 cents per acre and resettled there. Here you can see an early Osage camp on the reservation. The series of forced migrations had taken a tremendous toll on the tribe. Its population had dwindled to a few thousand, about a third of what it was only 70 years earlier. Then in 1906, just before Oklahoma became a state, the government forced upon the Osage the final stage of its brutal assimilation campaign, allotment. And under this policy, the Osage reservation will be divvied up into parcels, with each tribal member receiving one allotment, while the rest of the territory would be open to settlers. This was an Oklahoma land run, and the Osage had seen what happened when other territory nearby had been open to settlers. So the allotment system was designed to end the old communal way of life and turn American Indians into private property owners, a situation that would not, incidentally, make it much easier to procure their land. Now, during negotiations with Congress, the Osage had more leverage than other tribes that had been allotted because they owned a deed to their land. And there was also a great rush to make Oklahoma a state, and the Osage were the last tribe to be allotted. And they were led at the time by one of their greatest chiefs, a man who spoke 7 languages, including Latin. And he negotiated intensely, and he and other Osage leaders managed to slip into their treaty with the U.S. government for allotment a term that seemed very curious at the time. It said that we shall maintain all the subsurface mineral rights to our land. Now, the Osage knew that there were some bits of petroleum under their land, but nobody had any sense they were sitting upon a fortune. And the Osage shrewdly managed to hold on to this last realm of their land, a realm that they could not even see. Each Osage on the tribal roll received what was called a head right, which was essentially a share in the mineral trust. And after allotment, much of Osage surface territory disappeared into the hands of whites, the way it did with so many other tribes. But no one could buy a head right. It could only be inherited. And so the Osage maintained control of an area underneath their land the size of Delaware. They had become the world's first underground reservation. And before long, the oil boom had begun. There was such demand to drill in Osage Territory that prospectors, including oil barons like J.P. Getty and the Phillips brothers, came for regular auctions for leases. Here you can see the Phillips brothers and the members of their company, which became Conoco, arriving on what was known as the Millionaires Special. It was a private railroad card arriving in Pawhuska, that other town which I showed you in the silent footage. Now, the price for a single lease for a 160-acre tract of land had skyrocketed to as much as $2 million. And in good weather, the auctions were held under a very stately elm tree, which became known as the $1 million elm because the leases went for so much money. Now, as the Osage prosperity increased, many whites, Americans, expressed alarm. The U.S. Congress began to hold debates over the Osage wealth as if the nation's security were at stake. Now, you have to understand, this was the 1920s, the area of Great Gatsby and great prolificacy. And yet somehow the Osage were scapegoated for their money. And members of Congress would sit in their little mahogany panel rooms, and you can see the transcripts to this day debating, what are we going to do with all these Native Americans with all their money? They went so far as to appoint white guardians to many Osage. And this system was not only racist, it was literally based on the quantum of Osage blood. So if you were a full-blooded Osage, you were deemed incompetent and given a white guardian who could then dictate how you spent your fortunes down to the toothpaste you bought at the corner store. Not only was the system racist, it also created probably the greatest state-sanctioned system of criminality because the guardians became a criminal enterprise in which at least many of them would embezzle money, they would direct purchases to stores where they would get kickbacks. In many cases, they just made off with fortunes. At a congressional hearing, this Osage chief named Bacon Rind stood up and he testified that the whites had bunched us down here in the roughest part of the country, thinking, quote, we will drive these Indians down to where there is a big pile of rocks and put them there in that corner. Now that the pile of rocks has turned out to be worth millions of dollars, he said, everybody wants to get in here and get some of that money. Then the Osage began to die under mysterious circumstances. One family was profoundly impacted. This woman, Margie Burkhardt, who's one of the central protagonists of the book. Molly, who was born in 1886, grew up in a lodge, which was like a wigwam. You saw one of those pictures, the early pictures of the Osage camp. Practicing Osage traditions, speaking only Osage. Within a few decades, because of the oil money, she was living in a mansion. She was married to a white Texan settler named Ernest Burkhart. And in many ways, she straddled not only 2 centuries, but 2 civilizations. Now, they lived with their 2 children, and just for a little bit of context so you can understand what follows, their mother lived in the house with them, and Molly also had 2 other sisters, Anna Brown and Rita Smith, who lived nearby in separate houses. One day in May of 1921, Anna Brown, Molly's older sister, disappeared. Molly looked everywhere for her. She had family members look for her. And a week later, Anna Brown was found in a ravine, this picture was taken of the ravine by investigators at the time. And she had been shot in the back of the head. And it was the first hint that Molly's family had become a prime target of a criminal conspiracy, targeting not only her family, but the tribe. Not long after, within literally days, Molly's mother grew increasingly sick and insubstantial. She seemed to disappear and wither every day. Within 2 months, she was dead. She had stopped breathing. Evidence would later suggest that she had been poisoned. Here you could see a picture of Molly on the right with Anna Brown and her mother before they perished. And then soon after, Molly had another sister who I mentioned, Rita Smith. Rita was so frightened. She had lived actually out in the countryside with her white husband. They had a white maid who lived there full time. She was so scared that they moved closer to town. They were near where Molly lived. They had watchdogs. One night, one day they went outside and the watchdogs were dead. They had apparently been poisoned. Then one night about 3 in the morning, Molly heard a loud explosion. She got up, frightened, and went to the window and looked out where her sister's house had been. Here you could see a picture of the house that her sister had moved into. And she looked out at that house, and she couldn't see it anymore. All she could see was this large orange ball rising into the sky, as if the sun had burst violently into the night. Somebody had planted a bomb under the house. Not only was Molly's sister, Rita, killed, so was Rita's husband, Bill Smith, and so was the white maid who lived in the house who had 2 children at the time. And it wasn't only Molly's family that was being systematically targeted. There was an Osage champion steer roper who was in great shape, who one night received a call from his house. He went out, he came back. Shortly after he came back, he dropped dead, frothing. Evidence would later suggest that he had been given strychnine. Now, for those of you who know, strychnine is an awful poison often seen in Agatha Christie mysteries because of its brutality. It literally causes your body to convulse as if with electricity. You're conscious while you're slowly suffocating until you mercifully die. Now, many of those who tried to investigate the killings were themselves killed. There was an attorney who was gathering evidence. He had begun to store it in a safe where he told his wife a hiding spot. Then one day he was thrown off a speeding train. Shortly after, he told the sheriff that he had enough evidence to put one of the conspirators away. When his wife went to the designated hiding spot, it had been cleaned out, and all the evidence was gone. Another man traveled to Washington, D.C. He was an oil man who was close to the Osage to try to ask federal authorities for help. He checked into a boarding house in downtown. He received a telegram from Oklahoma that said, "Be careful." He carried with him a Bible and a pistol. He left the boarding house that night. He was abducted. At some point, a burlap sack was wrapped over his head. His body was then found in a culvert in Maryland the next morning. He had been beaten to death and stabbed more than 20 times. And the Washington Post said at the time what the Osage already abundantly knew, quote, "Conspiracy believed to kill rich Indians." By 1923, more than 24 people had been murdered in what had become known as the Osage Reign of Terror. One reporter wrote at the time, "The members of the tribe had been, quote, shot in lonely pastures, bored by steel as they sat in their automobiles, poisoned to die slowly, and dynamited as they slept in their homes." The reporter went on, "Where will it end? No one knows. The world's richest people were becoming the world's most murdered." Now, despite the danger to their lives, Molly Burkhardt and other Osage crusaded for justice, but white local authorities frequently ignored the crimes because of prejudice, because the victims were Native Americans. And at the time, one of the things that shocked me during my research was just how lawless this country was, how fragile its legal institutions were, and how often they were actually rotten to the core. It was very easy, if you were powerful, to pay off many lawmen. There was a great deal of corruption. There also was very little training in scientific detection, so poisoning became one of the most common means of killing the Osage, because even though scientists understood toxicology, it was easy to test for strychnine. Nobody did at the time in this area. You would just quickly bury the body and say, and thereby not produce concrete evidence that they could have easily done. Molly hired private detectives to great peril to her own life. Private detectives at the time often filled this void of law enforcement, but the problem with privatizing justice is that they could easily be purchased by the highest bidder. Many of them had criminal past. The boundary between a good man and a bad man was extremely porous, and the private eyes in the case seemed to be covering up evidence rather than revealing it. And in 1923, the Osage Tribal Council issued a resolution pleading for federal authorities to step in. And the case was then taken up by a little-known branch of the Justice Department, which was then known as the Bureau of Investigation, and what we would later come to know as the FBI. Now, one day in the summer of 1925, this man here, Tom White, a field agent in Houston, got an urgent summons by the new bossman in Washington, J. Edgar Hoover. He wanted to see him right away in person. Now, Like Molly, and Tom the story is told in Chronicles, Tom is another central figure. He also in many ways straddles 2 centuries. He was born at around the same time as Molly on a log cabin on the frontier in Texas. He was kind of part of a tribal community of lawmen. His father was a lawman. He watched people be hanged when he was a boy. He became a Texas Ranger at a time when justice was often meted out by the barrel of a gun. And now he suddenly, by the time of the Osage cases, he has to wear a suit and a fedora. He has to learn modern techniques like fingerprinting. He has to file paperwork, which he can't stand. It's the beginning of the professionalization. And one of the themes of the book is the kind of emergence of this country as a modern country. Now, when White had joined the Bureau in 1917, it still had only a few hundred agents and a smattering of field offices. It was a pretty ragtag operation. Agents were not authorized to carry guns and didn't have the power to make arrests. They'd actually have to go to a local lawman and say, can you now arrest this person? They also had very limited jurisdiction over crimes, and they didn't handle murder cases, except they had jurisdiction over American Indian reservations. So that's why the Osage murder case fell to them, and it became one of the FBI's first major homicide cases that it dealt with, and one of J. Edgar Hoover's first major homicide cases. Now, when White entered headquarters that day, he didn't know why he had been summoned, but he did know that Hoover had been purging a lot of the old frontier lawmen in favor of a new breed of agent, these college-educated boys who typed faster than they shot. The old-timers would mock them as Boy Scouts, and in fact, they really had very little experience investigating crimes at this point. And so Hoover, realizing that, had actually kept on just a few frontier lawmen who were very experienced, like Tom White. Tom White's brother was also kept on. They were known as the Cowboys, was inside the Bureau. And when White went to see Hoover, now White was about 6'4", and Hoover was rather small in stature. He hated tall agents. He actually kept a little dais behind his desk that he would stand on. And in fact, tall agents were terrified to be summoned to headquarters because if Hoover saw that they were really tall, he might purge them from the Bureau. So here he is staring at White, who is looming over him, and White should have been wearing a fedora, but he actually wore his cowboy hat, which would have been another sin. But Hoover begins to tell him about the Osage murder cases. And the Bureau had actually been investigating the crimes for 2 years, and the results had been completely disastrous. Agents had not only failed to make any arrests during that time, they had actually gotten an outlaw, a guy named Blackie, out of jail to serve as an informant. Instead, he slipped away, robbed the bank, and then killed the police officer. Now, here you can see a picture of Hoover. This was taken just a few months before White was summoned to the office. So that's exactly what he looked like. That was his desk. It's hard to recognize Hoover. He was 29 at the time when he became director. He didn't have his jowls, and he was still insecure about his power. This is a picture of Blackie, who would later try to escape from jail and meet a rather unfortunate fate. So Hoover feared a scandal after the Blackie incident. State officials were up in arms. One of the lawmen had been killed. I was under agent's responsibility. And so White realizes that Hoover has summoned him, one of the cowboys, to basically take over the Osage investigation and protect Hoover's job. Because it's hard to believe that Hoover still had his dreams of a bureaucratic empire, but at this stage he was new to the job and he feared a scandal could end his career. And after the meeting, White put together an undercover team. He drew from the old cowboys because he thought they were the only ones who could handle such a case. This is a granddaughter of this undercover operative sent me this picture. He was one of the undercover agents. Most interestingly is one of the undercover operatives was American Indian. And there are no statistics at the time, but I think it's safe to say that he was the only American Indian in Hoover's bureau at the time. These guys, they took on false identities. They posed as cattlemen. One posed as an insurance salesman. He'd actually once sold insurance in real life. And he actually, apparently, according to the record, sold real policies in Osage County. I don't know what happened to them, but he sold them. They had to adopt these modern techniques, including fingerprinting and handwriting analysis, which would become an important part of the case. And the investigation had many twists and turns. At times, it was more akin to espionage than a criminal investigation. There were moles and double agents and possibly even one triple agent. Reports were leaked. You never know who was your ally, who was betraying you. And I won't give away the end because I think it is more powerful to read it in the context of the book and how it unfolded. But White and his men ultimately followed the money to see who was benefiting from the killings, especially in Molly's family. And this led them to one of the masterminds of the plot. He was a white settler. What's more, he was someone close to Molly and many Osage. And that's one of the things that made these crimes so sinister. They involved a level of intimate deception and betrayal. They evoke to me the words, to best understand them, what Shakespeare once said. Where wilt thou find a cavern dark enough to mask thy monstrous visage? Seek none conspiracy. Hide it in smiles and affability. Now, after I had visited the Osage Nation Museum and saw this panoramic photograph, the museum director went down into the basement and she retrieved the missing panel and showed it to me. And there, peering out creepily from the side, was that mastermind, one of the masterminds who the FBI had arrested. He was the so-called devil she had been referring to. And I think it's important to understand that the Osage had removed that picture not to forget, as so many Americans had, but because they can't forget. Now, the book, just a quick word about the structure of the book, because it's different than any way I've ever kind of structured a book. It's told in 3 chronicles, and each one is told largely from the point of view of a different individual. The First Chronicle is told from the point of view of Molly, and this is a picture of her when she was older, before she died. I found a document that was very striking, that 2 years before she died, she had appealed her incompetency and was finally deemed competent. So only 2 years before her death, she was finally granted the rights of a full-fledged citizen to control access to her own fortune. The next chronicle is told largely from the point of view of Tom White, who you can see his transformation now from the days of the frontier with Hoover. And the third chronicle is narrated in the present by me to show what has happened to the Osage today, to give you some sense of their money. A lot of the boom towns are now ghost towns. They've vanished from the map. This was an old bar not far from where Anna was last seen alive. One of the most powerful things during my research, I tracked down descendants of both the murderers and the victims, and I tracked down, this is a descendant of Molly Burkhart. It's her granddaughter, a lovely woman named Margie Burkhardt. And she shared with me stories of what it was like to grow up with this very sinister conspiracy. Conspiracies where you often have perpetrators and victims living in houses side by side. And she spoke about having no relatives because of the murders. She took me out to the prairie where her family members are buried, and those are all their graves. And she gave me a sense of how this is still deeply living history and how it still reverberates to this day. And one of the reasons I structured the book this way, telling the story from these 3 distinct points of view, was to hopefully illuminate how hard it is to discern history as it is unfolding. Only in time does more of the portrait emerge. And in the third chronicle, I document based on a wealth of new information that though the FBI caught several of the killers, there was a deeper and darker conspiracy that it never exposed. Happy to answer any questions you all have. Thank you.
You said they arrested a number of people, typical of those sort of racial things that happened those days. Were they tried and convicted? And how many?
Yeah, it's a great question. So perhaps the bigger challenge was not just capturing the conspirators. The biggest challenge, arguably, was trying to convict them. These were very powerful white men, and at the time there was openly asked questions both by the Osage, would 12 jurors, all white, all men at the time, convict one of their own for committing crimes against Native Americans? And it was an arduous process. Jurors were bought. There was witness tampering. Some of the witnesses were almost kidnapped. And in the first case, it was a hung jury, and one of the jurors was bought off. They were ultimately able to convict a couple of them, a few of them, but many ultimately got away. The Bureau focused on a central conspiracy that was responsible for somewhere close to 24 murders. But one of the things I try to show is that in many ways this was a culture of complicity. It was much less a story about who did it than who didn't. It was much less a story about who did it than who didn't do it, because so many people were responsible. And sadly, many of them got away. Yes.
I very much look forward to reading the book, but I have a question, a more general question. You mentioned that you were in Osage country going to this museum. I'm kind of curious as to how you identify the projects that you focus on, because you seem to cast quite a wide net.
How I decide on the subject matter? Yeah, sure. So the question was, how do I decide on the subject matter for a project? I am a quintessential generalist. I almost never try to tell the same subject. I'm like that I'm like that college student who never grew up and moves on from one subject to the next. They say lots of knowledge, but very shallow, sadly. And it's hard to say. I mean, there's a rational process involved where you're looking for a story that hasn't been told. In a crime story, you're looking for obviously a story that is interesting, but you really don't want to just traffic in sensationalism. This story is really about, at its heart, it's got all this mystery, it's intrigue, it's got these crazy characters, these outlaws, and it's a kind of an insane story. I mean, but it ultimately is about this fundamental racial injustice that has been neglected by history, and it really is in many ways a microcosm of the forces that form this country that are still playing out in a very violent fashion as late as the 1920s. And so I think when you